So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar, Considering Carbon Credits, What Farmers Might Need to Know. I'm Deborah Crossan, and I'll be chairing this evening's webinar. It's a Raise Farm of the Future webinar, and looking at the various areas where farmers might be looking at farming for the future and decarbonising their farms. I would like to introduce the speakers today. Becky Willson from Farm Carbon Toolkit, you're very welcome, and Adam White from Roythornes Solicitors. Thank you very much for joining us. Now we have a Q&A bar on the Zoom call, so you can place your questions into there. And then between ourselves, Natasha and I, we will field the questions for our speakers. So I think to set the scene a little bit, the carbon markets are growing. Many farmers are potentially now being approached with offers to sell credits for the carbon they're sequestering through their soils or through potentially agroforestry. Now, this could sound promising and a potential new income stream, but is it the right thing for the environment? And the picture is quite complex. The rules are evolving and there are risks as well as opportunities. So we hope to help demystify the process, flag up the key legal and financial considerations, and hear, potentially how people might be navigating this space. We're not really promoting carbon sales, but just liking to give farmers information so that they can make informed decisions. Now we're going to hear two short contributions from our panel, and then we will open up for questions and discussion. So there, I'd like to hand over to Becky, and we'll start the conversation.
Thanks very much, Deb, and hopefully there we go. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be here this evening. It's lovely to come along and talk about this topic around how farmers can get paid for carbon. And what I'm going to do, hopefully, is just set the scene a little bit and think about some of the key concepts and key things we might want to think about as farmers if we're sort of wanting to start to navigate this world of accessing private finance, thinking about those wider things that we are delivering as farmers over and above food production. And as I say, these are things that we think about quite often at Farm Carbon Toolkit. For anybody that doesn't know us, obviously we're farmer-led to try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving soil health, and also improving business resilience. So, I mean, I think unless you've been hiding under a rock for the last few years, there is this real increasing interest and urgency that's coming in terms of our ability to act not on climate change. Now, as farmers, we are one of the industries that is most at risk of the direct impacts of climate change. Okay, we are all, as I say, bemoaning the fact that we've not had any water fall out the sky for goodness knows how long. Thankfully, hopefully for you guys, it's started to arrive now. But how we manage our business really is directly impacted by what happens in terms of our weather and our climate systems. So for us as a business, thinking about climate change, thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, all of that sort of stuff makes a lot of sense. But we're all now starting to see, with the increase in legislation in terms of net zero aspirations, in terms of all of these sorts of things, there is a lot more pressure that's coming on individuals, that's coming on farms, that's coming on organisations to be able to act on these sorts of things. And you'll start to see a variety of different commitments that are made by different supply chains, organisations, in terms of their ability to get to net zero. And alongside this sort of, this desire and this increasing interest, it's meaning that carbon is becoming something that is increasingly more valuable. And that's valuable not only because of the fact that it's seen as a mechanism to be able to achieve these objectives that we need to do, but also it's something that potentially as farmers we have a resource of that could be used either further up the supply chain or by other industries that don't have the same opportunities that we have. And I suppose what's really worth thinking about at this point, and hopefully it'll be something that we'll sort of tease out in the conversations later on, is that although we are able to deliver some of these solutions for other sectors, as a sector in terms of agriculture, we are responsible for about 12% of UK greenhouse gas emissions. So we also have to deal with decarbonising agriculture as an industry, as well as thinking about how that balance hits with what we can do for other sectors. But basically, what that means is for farmers, we are in the middle and everybody is looking at us in terms of our ability to do multiple things. Number one, produce food. Number two, protect the environment. Number three, to manage water and nutrient cycles. Number four, to think about reducing emissions, as I just said, in terms of the fact that some of those emissions are coming from us as a sector, but also that ability for us to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold it on our farms. And that carbon might be held within trees and hedges. It might be held if we've got high carbon environments in terms of things like peatlands. It might be held in terms of in our soils. And because we have this ability to do that, and we are almost unique in terms of that ability, it suddenly means that we are being watched by multiple different sectors that potentially might not have been that interested in the past. We can see quite easily in terms of that sort of vertical alignment with things like supply chains. But we're also starting to see those financial institutions. So we're starting to see insurance companies. We're starting to see our banks looking at how farmers might be able to de-risk what's happening in terms of investment, might be able to think about how that fits in to adaptation. We're also starting to see those allied industries that we deal with in terms of whether that's bringing inputs into the farm, see how we can do that way as well. So suddenly there's lots of attention on us in terms of that ability to decarbonise and how that can be used by various different sectors. But what we also know is that we need to make sure that we do not become carbon tunnel visioned. Okay, carbon is incredibly important. And obviously for me, in terms of the Farm Carbon Toolkit, it's a lot of what we talk about. But we know that it is not the only aspect of farm sustainability that we are thinking about. We know that we are also thinking about management of those natural cycles. We're thinking about nutrients. We're thinking about animal welfare. We're thinking about food. We're thinking about water, all of these other things. And so when we're evaluating and thinking about projects that we might be doing on the farm, we want to make sure that we don't get tunnel visioned. We can think about the impact of what we might be being asked to do from a wider perspective than just thinking about carbon. Because again, it can seem like we're very much being led down this path because that's currently where the interest is. But thinking about fundamentally, does this make sense for my farm? Is it taking me in the direction I want to go? Is it allowing me to protect those resources that I have on the farm in terms of my soils, my rotations, all of those sorts of things when we're starting to make that decision? Because as I've said already, we are the ones that people are looking at the moment because we have this unique ability to store carbon on our farm. And it's really important to think here about the difference between sequestration, as Deb was talking about at the beginning, and carbon storage. Because our farms are one of the biggest stores of carbon that we have. So our farms are storing lots and lots, tons and tons of carbon on them. But when we think about what we're doing in terms of our annual carbon footprint, the hundreds of thousands of tons of carbons that are already stored in our soil, we can't take against that annual emissions. What we need to think about is how those stores of carbon are changing and evolving over time. And that's really the true definition of that sequestration. So as farmers, we've sort of almost got two jobs to do. We have to protect the carbon that we've already got, because obviously if that is then emitted, that becomes an emission that we have to deal with. But on the other side, we have to identify those opportunities that we might have to sequester more carbon. And that, again, may well be thinking about incorporating more areas of woody biomass on the farm. It might be thinking about management of existing environmental areas, or it might be thinking about adapting and changing our farming practices to be able to put more carbon in our soil. And the starting point for thinking about all of these exciting things that are happening is getting a baseline. And that's one of my really important messages that I sort of give you all this evening, is that all of those exciting conversations that you might have about who wants to pay you for stuff, the starting point for all of that is a baseline. And so carbon footprinting allows you an opportunity to look at what is your current position, quantifying areas on the farm which are generating emissions, look at what you're currently doing in terms of where you're currently storing and sequestering carbon, and can be a really important thing to be able to identify potential opportunities to use moving forward. Because as I say, we think a lot when we're thinking about carbon markets about things like woodland carbon code, those sorts of things that are predominantly dealing with the above ground carbon. And a lot of the interest, especially when we think about some of the pledges that have been made by large multinational corporations, very much what's got them excited is the potential of the below ground carbon. And if we think about how we do the monitoring and reporting and verification, all of that, it's about understanding how much carbon we've already got, where it is in terms of what depth down our soil profile, and what are those practices that we might be able to adopt that will help to put more carbon in the soil. And then more importantly for us as farmers, what benefit is that going to have to our business? So let's just think for a minute around, okay, we're interested. What do we do? So if we think more broadly around getting paid for carbon on farms, there are a variety of schemes that are out there already. So they have schemes that potentially are paying for sustainability. Land that's in stewardship or those sorts of things. We've got various different operations which are sort of thinking about sustainability from a wider perspective. And through that support, it may well be either directly or indirectly supporting carbon reduction alongside it. But we have less schemes that are specifically designed to pay farmers for carbon reduction or carbon sequestration. We have the Woodland Carbon Code, which again is a sort of, government-backed set of schemes which look at supporting farmers or any landowners to be able to plant land up to trees. We also have a peatland restoration code. So if you have peatland on your farm and it's potentially not a great condition, you can change that condition score. And again, there is a mechanism there to be able to do that. Now, both the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Restoration Code have been backed by the government. There is a UK land carbon registry. You can look at projects, all of that sort of transparency. We've got building work that's currently happening in terms of soil carbon code and also the hedgerow carbon code. Both of these potentially are sort of more mainstream to be able to access alongside farming. Obviously, if we're thinking about woodland carbon, it's taking land and taking it out of sort of food production and putting it into trees. If we're thinking about peatland, again, that is sort of quite a specific habitat. Soil carbon and hedgerow carbon seem to be sort of the ones that are more interesting because they are able to be run alongside sort of current farming operations in terms of thinking about how we manage those. And those schemes that pay farmers specifically for carbon may involve this idea of carbon offsetting or carbon insetting. And again, these terms can be sort of sometimes used interchangeably, but they do mean slightly different things. Now, what's also worth remembering at this point is that we have sort of two different carbon markets. And the carbon market that we're thinking about in terms of where farmers can potentially access this private finance is the voluntary carbon market. We have carbon compliance markets, which is much bigger, and it's what governments use in terms of being able to demonstrate progress around things like emissions reductions and emissions trading and all of that sort of stuff. Very much that is for very, very large scale businesses or for countries to deal with. When we're thinking about the possibilities for farmers to access this, we are thinking about that voluntary carbon market. And that voluntary carbon market is that market where carbon credits, and for a carbon credit, basically read a piece of paper that is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, which can be bought and sold, and that can be used voluntarily to actually start to show progress over time in terms of reporting. Okay, so you can see there in terms of Microsoft are one of the quite well-known ones in terms of what they're doing in terms of showing progress to get to net zero and the use of the voluntary carbon market to do that. Now, another thing to think about for us as farmers, how are we selling our carbon? So if we're accessing that voluntary carbon market, that often is seen as that offset, okay? Now, what happens if we're thinking about accessing it and doing a carbon offset is that the benefit that you are doing in terms of the practice that you might be implementing or the benefit that's happening within your soil, that benefit you are selling out of your supply chain and off your farm, and it is going to help another business that is not allied to your business. Okay, so that is traditionally where the sort of voluntary carbon market has come from. What we're starting to see a lot more of now is carbon insetting, where the benefit of what you're doing at the farm level is felt and been able to report it all the way along that supply chain. And just to sort of show you a little bit of an example of that, again, in terms of you can see sort of a fairly sort of simplistic graphic here. But if you sort of had before the project where the baseline was done and the farm was responsible for 7 tons of carbon, I mean, it would be much more than that. The processor was responsible for 3, and the retailer was responsible for 2. You can see that the total footprint of that end product, okay, is 12. What would happen is that the retailer and the processor would then fund the interventions that the farm would do so that the benefit in terms of that reduction that happened on farm could be reported all the way up the supply chain. Okay. And again, that is sort of what's seen as insetting. If you'd gone that out and looked at that in the offsetting market, the benefit would have disappeared out of your supply chain. And that's where it's then really important to think about things like if your supply chain are potentially going to be asking you to do this in the future and you sold that off the farm, where are you then going to be in the position in terms of being able to deliver the benefits that they want you to do? Really importantly, and this is a question that I get quite often, am I selling all the carbon in my soil? And the answer is no. So when we think about some of these projects and these sort of schemes that are starting to be trialed at the moment, the really important thing to start off with is that you have a baseline. Okay, and that baseline is measuring where your soil carbon is at year 0, which is the start of the project. Then you introduce the practice or the thing that you're going to do that's going to build that soil carbon. Then you're measured again at an interval. It could be year 5, it could be year 10. And that change against the baseline is what you then potentially have available to sell, do whatever you want with. Okay, so you are not getting rid of everything in your soil. It's the change, it's the uplift. Remember what I said earlier about the difference between storage and sequestration, which is where the importance of baselining comes in. Having an understanding about where you are currently, the headroom that you have to be able to improve that, and then what are the practices that you might be able to do to increase that. Now, I know Adam's going to touch quite a lot on these sorts of issues, so I'm only going to skirt over this quite briefly. But really, really importantly, there is a huge range at the moment in terms of how schemes and projects have been set up, their design, their quality. Really important to think at the start and ask the difficult questions. So number 1, really importantly, think about how is the measurement and verification happening? Are they actually coming out, digging holes, poking holes in your fields to actually get that baseline data? Is it being based on a model? Because again, there's that real sort of cost benefit analysis, but real data has the highest level of integrity. Also worth thinking about, what scope is that project? So is it taking account of everything that's happening on your farm? Is it just looking at one field? Or is it just open to one enterprise? So for example, if you have an arable enterprise and you also have a beef enterprise, it may well be that the arable enterprise is what they're used to, because often the models really struggle with livestock or mixed farms. And again, horrible slide, but this just really starts to think about some of the issues that we've got in terms of what does the science tell us? What do we know? What might be slightly more tricky at a farm level, and what's difficult in terms of how we manage and govern these systems. And very much the really big one at the moment that is sort of getting a lot of people scratching their heads is actually that top one. How accurate do we need to be in terms of quantifying those changes in soil carbon over time? Do we need to poke a hole in every centimetre of every field, which is incredibly costly? How can we use some sampling along with modelling, all of those the market bear in terms of that level of accuracy that's required, as well as thinking about how long is that carbon going to stay there. So the idea of permanence, realizing that we've got biological systems. It's not like a tree. You plant a tree, unless something catastrophic happens, that tree will be there for 80 years. Soil carbon is much more in a cycle. So thinking about how long that carbon's there, what we need to put in place there is really important. So we have a UK soil carbon code that is in development. There was work that was done in 2022 around thinking about what the minimal requirements were. Then sort of in 2023, there was a launch of a sort of a British standards, DEFRA nature market standards program. And then thinking about going on from that in terms of the evolution, we now have the sort of principles of the voluntary carbon and nature markets, trying to understand that we're not just sequestering carbon, there's also potential for biodiversity markets, all those sorts of things. And that framework at the moment very much is sort of in development. So the UK Soil Carbon Code is not an off-the-shelf solution that you can access, but it is in development at the moment, thinking about standardizing methodologies for testing and thinking about how we can do that in a transparent way. And there's a consultation going on at the moment to think about how we implement this, as well as some pilot projects. Just to finish off, there was some really good research that was done by the Sustainable Soils Alliance back at the end of 2023, which did loads and loads of surveying, looking at what are the current barriers in terms of implementation of, carbon markets with farmers. And it's they broke it down into four main areas. Number one, in terms of knowledge, and that's what sessions like this evening are really useful for. What are the things that we don't know? What do we need to know? How complex is the marketplace? Where do we think about what scale we're at? All of those sorts of things. Then there was a whole piece around emotion. Actually, what do we want to do this? Actually, who's owning the data? All of that sort of stuff around, does this fit for my farm and what I'm trying to manage? Then a whole bit around contracts, which I'm very much going to leave to Adam. And then the fourth bit, thinking about the economics. Is this actually going to be worthwhile? Am I getting a sensible return on investment? What am I being asked to do in terms of what the price of carbon that I'm going to get back? So just to finish off, and I'm sorry, I've covered lots of topics there, but hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So I think fundamentally, nobody can disagree with the fact that farmers should be rewarded for doing the right thing. And that's both for carbon and all of the other things that we are delivering. And blended finance makes sense. The principles of it make sense for supporting the multitude of things that we deliver to society over and above food production. Offsetting, there are various challenges that are associated with it at the moment, so go careful. Don't rush into anything and ask the difficult questions. The starting point for everything is a baseline. So again, having a look at something like doing your carbon footprint to understand the potential for what you've got is a really useful thing that you can do now. It doesn't cost you anything. You can do it for free, and it really gives you that information that you can use moving forward. Carbon markets in their current form are not the solution. They are evolving. They are continuing to improve. It's really important for us to be able to understand how that links with things like ecosystem payments. And we need to be honest in terms of what's possible. We know that the implementation of things like regenerative agriculture take time. They don't increase in a linear fashion. So we need to be able to have a system that is fluid enough to be able to deal with peaks and troughs. We can't put our farms and nature on a balance sheet. And that's what we're trying to do in terms of these carbon accountancy frameworks and private markets. So we have to be able to have that flexibility and nuance to be able to let those cycles do what they need to do. And I'll stop talking at that point. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Becky. That's absolutely brilliant. I mean, breaking down the complexity of this and showing how that landscape is evolving. Really excellent introduction to it. There are questions coming in, but I think we'll move straight on to Adam and let him put forward his understanding of the legals and the risk side of this. So over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Becky. That was really useful. I'm going to do the typical lawyer thing, and I've got nothing in writing to show you, so you get to look at my face for the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm Adam White. I'm Chief Executive of Roythornes LLP, who are a national law firm that works with farmers and landowners. We've done a huge amount of work around biodiversity net gain and are looking at carbon markets, but also some of the more more historic carbon markets like trees and peatland. But I've also been head of agriculture for Barclays for 5 years. So I'm hopefully coming at this topic from a banking and legal perspective, because I think some of the considerations are similar. The other thing I'd say is I try not to be a doom monger on this topic, but I think it's really important that risk consideration from a banking and a legal perspective for farmers and landowners is really, really important before engaging in anything. And it's really vital to understand what those risks and considerations are. But I'm gonna kind of start with the end, which is my message would be the same as Becky's. You have to baseline, because you could spend the next 10 years considering all of the risks if you're quite risk averse. But by the time you get to the end of that 10 years and you've made your mind up, if you haven't got a baseline, it's very, very, very difficult to go backwards and record the position that you were in before you started taking all of the other actions that you've taken on farm to improve nature or to improve carbon. So baselining is the key message I think you should take away. If you turn off now, that's the key message. So there's four key considerations that we look at from a legal perspective and a banking perspective, and we'll talk to clients about. First one is absolutely the biggest one, which is the long-term nature of some of these commitments. So soil carbon schemes are still evolving. That I don't think we're in the final place, but they're typically for around 10 years. So they're a 10-year commitment. You've got a 5-year upfront commitment through a company like a greener, and then a 5-year follow-on commitment because you've sequestered that soil. You can't just dig it all up at the end of that. You have to keep it in there for a period. They are still mainly for the arable sector, though, the ones that I've seen for soil carbon, and they're often focused on reductions as well as removals, and they still are relatively quite new. I think one of the challenges with any new market is obviously you have to have a seller and you have to have a buyer. And Becky talked about the money that Microsoft spent in the voluntary carbon credit market. There has obviously been, for a number of companies that have engaged in that market, some criticism as to the fact that they haven't tried to reduce their own emissions before going out and buying credits. So that's on their mind. So that's made the buyer's market quite difficult because you want to ensure that if you're buying credits, that they are secure, that they're viable. We did see a period when there was particularly, I think, early on in the schemes where there was all kinds of things going on in the Amazon rainforest where people were capturing carbon that they shouldn't have been, and there's been some buyers of these credits that have been stung by that. So it's really important that the metrics and standards work, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Where we have seen a number of years of activity now is for tree-based or peatland schemes, which are quite different in that they're long-term contractual commitments. And I think some of the learns that we've had from that are quite important to consider when you're looking at soil carbon schemes. So with those schemes, it does potentially impact the sale or transfer of land, the ability to let that land for between 35 to 70 years, and in some cases even longer. So you can see why a number of our clients have a hesitancy about committing to them, because 35 to 70 years is it could be up to 2 generations. And then once you start to get into the small print of what you can and can't do on the land, that's something that needs to be considered. The other part is, and this is more from a banking perspective and also from a kind of balance sheet perspective, there is an impact, I think valuers are trying to understand what the impact of these schemes is on land long term. So particularly with forestry and peatland schemes, and this isn't so much for soil carbon schemes, but if you decide at the end of those that you want to bring that back into farming, particularly with forestry, how do you do that? Can you do that? Does the land change into non-agricultural use after a period? And we've also seen that with biodiversity net gain, where those schemes are typically 35 years plus. What happens to that land at the end of it? Does it carry all of the tax benefits that you would have with farmland? Nutrient neutrality is another one where, again, valuers that I've spoken to in the past have really struggled with nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, and carbon schemes to value land. And the reason for that is because the land effectively carries a liability, because the payment in some cases, more so for forestry, nutrient neutrality, and biodiversity net gain, is made up front. So whoever buys that land in the future has to carry on providing what's been paid for on that land, be that carbon or be that biodiversity net gain. And that it's obviously going to have an impact on what the value of that land is. So it's something that's really important to consider. It's really something that engaging in any kind of soil biodiversity net gain schemes needs to be considered, and talk to a local valuer around what those are. So soil schemes are, though, shorter. So they are tied to food production. You produce food at the same time, so you're consistently farming the land as well as reducing the reducing the carbon. However, that is probably the most complex area of this, is thinking about that long-term nature. The second one, and Becky's touched on this, is the supply chain suspicions. So I think a number of farmers that I have spoken to are suspicious of schemes or incentives that are offered by retailers or intermediaries in the supply chain. And that's, in some ways, that's understandable. There's certainly a tension, or there has been a tension between farmers and the supply chain in the past around who owns what, who produces what. I think certainly in the dairy supply chain, we've seen that work. I've seen that work really, really well over the last couple of years in terms of the support to deliver is provided by the supply chain, and the benefits are shared. But we're not quite seeing that in arable because the supply chain is much more sort of diffused. The ownership of carbon reductions or removals will matter for the supply chain because it's something that they are talking about, but it is a minefield from our perspective, from a legal perspective, on how that impacts the land, how that impacts what you can farm, how that impacts your ability to switch supply contracts, how we document those things, and what those implications are going forward of reducing and removing carbon. I do think we could also end up in a situation where, for some areas of the supply chain, those carbon credits could be seen as an entry requirement for doing business with a supplier. So it's really important that if you do take the decision to sell anything, and I go back to my previous comment about where the market is, that if you do that, that could impact your ability to work with certain suppliers in the future if they feel that that's part of an entry requirement for them doing business. So I think understanding who you're supplying to, what their involvement in these schemes are, what support they offer is certainly worth relying on, and what the length and terms of those are and how they work in the future is a really important consideration. The third consideration really is metrics and standards, and this is still a work in progress. Becky's just talked about the soil carbon code, and I guess from a lawyer's perspective, what we wanted were really solid metrics and proxies as we had for woodland, and the woodland carbon code is very, very sort of structured, and that's not where we've got to at the moment with the groups that are working on it. We've ended up with a set of principles which standards and platforms need to respect. So it's not really a you must do X, Y, and Z. It's more of a principles of, we would expect to see this, this, and this, and that's it's a hard one to solve because soil carbon is complex, and the science around that keeps developing. But at the same time, lawyers and bankers like detail, and farmers like detail if they're making long-term decisions on the back of things that are principles at this stage. Those metrics and standards will continue to change. And I think we've seen that certainly over the last probably 10 years as we've moved from, we're not going to reward you for not cutting down rainforest in the Amazon. We've now moved towards how do we capture, how do we reduce carbon in soil. But for example, at the weekend, there was quite a bit of press coverage around something called rock weathering, which is a process whereby farmers spread a type of rock on the soil, and that is an effective way of capturing carbon. Now, if I look at carbon credit prices from probably about a year ago, soil carbon credits were running at around sort of circa £20 per tonne of CO2 equivalent, and rock weathering credits were running at 5 to 6 times more valuable than soil carbon credits. And that's purely because that is pure capture of CO2. It's not you're doing something that reduces the amount of CO2 that your soil is releasing. It's actually you're capturing, you're not creating it, you're actually capturing it. And I think what we'll see over the next 2 or 3 years is we will continually see the metrics and standards improve and change, and we will see buyers in the market being more focused on quality and capture of carbon, and we will see that with some of the technology that's coming along as well. The fourth area, and I think this is the one that probably ties it all together for me, is that there just is not enough money in it at the moment. So if we look at that sort of circa £20 per tonne, when you add up where you could possibly be today from a soil carbon perspective, it's not going to change the world. And where that long-term certainty about where carbon price will go, and its current low level at £20 per tonne, will that go up? Will it come down as standards change? Do you engage in something now that you're tied into a contract for 2 or 3 years? You've got that commitment, but at the end of it, the standards have changed, and you need to change what you're doing, and there will be that constant need to do something. But it doesn't create enough from a market perspective. If you think typically there's going to be an investor, there's going to be somebody who's buying these credits, there's going to be a broker, so there's going to be somebody who's going to have to work between the investor and the landowner to make sure that everybody understands what's being signed up for. There's probably going to be some demand from the supply chain, there's a lot of people there in that supply chain that are not going to be able to see enough value from £20 per tonne of CO2 to be able to realise what they need to, and to ensure that, to the earlier point that Deborah made, that farmers get the real value from this. So I think that's why we've not seen a huge uptake of it in recent time. There's a lot of excitement, but we haven't seen as much activity in terms of actually making deals. The other point I would just make for certainly for landowners is for tenants. So opportunities are quite limited for tenants, other than for the shorter 5-year soil management programs. And again, that's a discussion between landlord and tenant as to how do they work together to realise value in some of the longer term schemes, but also there may be a need for some of the shorter term schemes to ensure that there's an ongoing value for that. Who's viable for what? Who gets paid for what? Who is there an impact on the land value? Because obviously, from a tenant's perspective, that would have no impact, but for a landlord, it would have a significant impact if they've got a tenant who is engaging in schemes that could impact on land values. And that all conspires to mean that we're actually not seeing many creative deals. There are some, but we're not seeing many. And I think there is a general consensus that selling carbon credits, particularly in the peatland and the forestry sectors itself, isn't agricultural. So there's already a potential risk there for tenants whose tenancies permit agricultural use only, never mind other restrictions on schemes and tree planting, etc. So the longer term schemes are less attractive to tenants. Some of the shorter term schemes, there certainly needs to be more landlord and tenant discussion. So the takeaway for me really is that there are a number of issues, and it's one of those areas that becomes quite complex when you start using sort of words that are quite complex around this area. They're being worked through, and I think there's a number of companies, there's a number of groups that we talked about earlier with the Soil Carbon Code that are working through how does this practically work. Naturally, there will be farmers and landowners who can afford to take a risk, and there are certainly some estates across the UK who have already engaged in how do these schemes work, and they'll be the ones that kind of smash through the wall for all of us and work out how these carbon trading schemes can practically work, how you get the most value from them. But I wouldn't want anybody to be put off by all that complexity, because I think I reiterate my point at the start. One of the key things, and I tell this to every single client I see, even if they say to me, there's no carbon, I'm not doing that, I'm not getting involved in that, is you have to baseline. The cost is relatively low, and as Becky says, it's virtually zero in most cases. But having that baseline will enable you to engage with these schemes later down the line. Even if you don't want it today, it's going to enable you to do that, and that you don't change your practices, have 5 years of improvement in your soil, and you've lost all of that. So please baseline, have a look at some of the tools out there, like Becky's tool, and set yourself a baseline. So that's it from me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adam. Now, the questions are piling in, and I've got one here which also is backed up in the chat. So I'll try and pull the two questions together, and that is, how can a farmer get the most out of the carbon credits where there's options to stack biodiversity credits, but also with the question in the chat, and where does HMRC stand are you still a farming business if you were going for the carbon and biodiversity option, if that makes sense?
So I'll have to check the HMRC guidance, but I know there was some guidance around what was classified as agricultural land, and biodiversity net gain was part of that. So I think there was some changes to that recently. In terms of the stacking, I think and Becky can perhaps talk a little bit in a moment about where she sees it, but from my perspective, where I tend to see it is more food production with either biodiversity or carbon stacked on top. So there's a fantastic farm over in Essex who's gone into fruit production alongside biodiversity net gain, and that's a good way of being able to create a habitat and to be able to still produce food at the same time. So I think if you end up doing carbon and biodiversity, you're taking land completely out of production to do that. If you can do one with the other, then there's a joint benefit, because to go back to that HMRC point, you're still producing food, you're still contributing towards food production in the UK. But Becky, I'll come over to you if you've got any other.
No, I mean, I think certainly, and Adam, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought, as far as I was aware, you couldn't, if you were doing BNG, you couldn't then stack carbon on the top of it. Am I wrong?
I think there is something about that, yeah.
Yeah, I know, and I know in the early days of biodiversity net gain, that very much was the guide. We were all hoping that you could, because we know that these landscapes are performing multiple functions, but it was one, it was one or the other. Now, certainly, we're involved in quite a few sort of landscape recovery type projects where there's lots of people coming together across an area to sort of look at what they can deliver in terms of those multiple environmental outputs. And certainly the conversations where they're starting to talk about to investors in those is very much, instead of stacking, we're bundling. And that sort of change in terminology seems to potentially bring a little bit more flexibility. And I think, coming back to some of the things that Adam was talking about earlier, absolutely, at the moment with carbon at £20 a tonne, why would you? Because the amount of headache and stuff that you have to do in terms of baselining, absolutely not. But actually, if you could think about the case where potentially you could get £20 a tonne for that, and you could get another, £25 a tonne for some nutrient stuff you were doing, and another bit for water, then suddenly it starts to make sense. And I think we need to try and work out the flexibility to be able to look at how can we offer these sort of multiple packages or bundle things together, because we know we're not dealing with any of these things in isolation, but trying to do that in a cost effective way, which means that we don't then, coming back to Adam's example earlier, we don't end up with 3 brokers in the middle that we're having to all of that sort of stuff, I think is to be worked out. But as I say, I know in terms of, or as I say, I was under the impression that if you were biodiversity net gaining, you couldn't also carbon for the same activity. Whereas if we think about it in terms of, rather than potentially being prescriptive, and I think the early carbon schemes at the moment very much are that prescription based. So if we think about the likes of a greener, you do no-till, you do cover crops, those are the practices. And obviously the people that are issuing those credits will say, yes, there is enough science and good understanding that those practices, along with some backing up in terms of soil testing, is going to deliver a benefit. I think one of the things is, if we try and move in a more, in a way where we can deliver outputs rather than practices, then it leads a little bit more flexibility for what we're delivering. However, we've got to do that in terms of the monitoring in a cost-effective way.
Thank you both. Moving on with some of the questions, there's some around, if you can answer, what is the situation opportunity in Wales and the devolved nations? And that same person is asking, which I think we could add in, if you've been doing good management over a period of 10 years, is that disadvantaging you or putting you further up this opportunity scale? So
yeah, so I mean, I think it's a question I get quite often, in terms of, actually, my whole farm is down to grass. Is the best thing for me to do and go and plough it all up, so that we're starting from a low base and then get paid to put it all back in again. And in the early schemes, absolutely that could be done. And I think, as Adam was talking about in terms of the guidelines around UK Soil Carbon Code, one of the things that's written within those guidelines is that you have to look at what the land has been used for the last 10 years to exactly try and avoid that opportunity that we just plough it, we then do something good for 10 years, then we plough it again, and we just go around that circle, because that's not getting us where we want to get to. So there is going to be a bit of, depending on what you're currently doing, depending on your current farming systems, if you've already got really high organic matter soils, as I said, potentially where is your headroom? I think there is a lot more nuance in that than is often put about. Is one of the reasons why, as Adam mentioned earlier, arable's been much easier to get through the system, because there's a lot less moving parts when we're thinking about carbon cycles. Suddenly, when we think about livestock and grassland and all of those sorts of things, certainly from the work that we've done through Soil Carbon Project and those sorts of things, soils that can be quite high in organic matter still have that ability to sequester carbon. It depends where you're taking the measurements down the soil profile, all of those sorts of things. But it does rely on a more measurement-based approach rather than the computer says, if you do this, that's the end point. In terms of Wales, I think obviously we're waiting for, sustainable farming scheme in terms of understanding what that's going to be like from a public finance perspective. There's nothing to preclude access to those private markets, and a bit like Adam was saying in terms of some of that insetting that's going on. I know through some of the dairy supply chains, those sorts of farmers are able to access incentive payments for doing certain things. But as far as I know, there aren't any projects in Wales that are, through the voluntary carbon market. The only real one that we have in the UK at the moment is a greener, in terms of the work that they're doing with arable farmers on a sort of field by field scale. So that's not to say that you couldn't access that if you were in Wales, but certainly in terms of devolved administrations, looking at what can currently be done through sustainable farming schemes, what their sort of guidelines are in terms of testing and all of that sort of stuff, can mean that baselining hopefully can be a little bit easier if you can access some of the schemes to do that baselining.
And just to add on the Wales piece, so Farming Connect has got some useful information for anybody that's in Wales. Wales is, so the UK have got this, and you'll have perhaps seen in the news recently, they've tried to align the EU and the UK's emissions trading scheme. So the Welsh Government, the Scottish Government and Northern Ireland Executive are all involved in that process. The bit I would say with that is that the EU trading scheme excludes agriculture, so that's been excluded from it. So that's going to mean it's still a voluntary market, but because it's a voluntary market, it's accessible to anybody in the UK. But I think, Becky, probably the biggest challenge is that the majority of Wales will be upland or grassland, and the schemes just don't work for that at the moment. Because the argument would be, well, if you didn't have anything on the grassland would still be there. So how do you sort of show that you're making an improvement to what is already there? So, but it does apply to Wales, definitely. BNG doesn't. So just to stress on that, that's only England.
Brilliant, thank you. Good questions coming in, but I've got one here that you might be able to get your teeth into. Any protection or insurance that might come about if there was some sort of natural disaster, flooding or something that we can't foresee that undoes the work that you've done for your credits? Is there anything like that on the horizon, or has that been thought of?
So from an insurance perspective, I haven't seen anything. I think the way I've seen it positioned at the moment, certainly from a biodiversity net gain perspective, which we're further along on, and from woodland, is that I mean, the woodland schemes are quite different because you sell what you think the potential value is, and then once you've realised it and you've avoided those weather dangers, then you sell what the actual value is. So it's slightly different there. Whereas with the soil, I mean, I don't think it's an issue, because if you did have a flood, you're not turning the soil over, you're not releasing the carbon, you just carry on your practice once that returns. So there isn't an insurance, and I think it would be very hard to get an insurance for that type of scheme, or to treat when it's not something I've seen. But Becky, I don't know if you've seen anything in the market or.
No, and I think it comes back down to, I suppose, the length of time for the contract and the monitoring periods, because absolutely soils are going to flux throughout the year. They are inherently dependent on weather conditions, moisture content, and management. So making sure that we are not measuring and monitoring too frequently is really, really important. And I know in the early days, I had quite a few people phone me up being like, I want to measure every month. And I was like, you absolutely don't, because you're going to give your investors heart failure. What we're looking at is, and what we want to be able to capture is long-term change, not short-term fluctuations in a biological system. So really making sure that the frequency of monitoring is set in a way that you're not going to see that sort of boom and bust as at the moment. If we look at the fact no water's fallen out the sky for, I know that the soil carbon levels are going to have gone down. But if we, that's not to say that they're not going to build back up. And it's also about thinking about thresholds. So, again, we're not selling everything that's in our soil. We're selling that improvement and putting a buffer on to make sure that we can deliver that. And various different schemes have various different buffer mechanisms that you pay into.
Thank you. There's a lovely question here on dung beetles, because we're organising an event in June that is going to be talking about dung beetles. So you can probably see that question in there. I mean, I don't know if anyone would like to tackle it or have
I
a
love
comment
it. Yeah,
about it. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, it comes back to something that Adam was talking about earlier. We know, I mean, dung beetles are incredible. They are fantastic. We love them. They are doing brilliant things. And I think in terms of that, they are, for me, the wonder species that connects below ground biodiversity with above ground biodiversity, because they do trajectory. If you look at the published research on dung beetles are incredible because they actually reduce emissions. So actually that process by which they break down that dung pat, actually on a dung pat by dung pat level, if you've got good populations of dung beetles, you can actually afford a lower emissions factor associated with your cattle. So, at the moment, the challenge is what is that level of acceptable dung beetles that allows us to then tick that box to say that you can put a lower emissions factor associated with that manure deposition. And at the moment, we don't have that. And almost we would get to a point where, well, how do we assess that actually you've got the right number of dung beetles? But absolutely, they are incredibly important. And especially, when we've done footprints on places like Dartmoor and that sort of stuff, we know that, if you take the bespoke value emissions factor for a cow, actually that's probably going to be overestimating the impact of that cow when you take into account where it is, presence of dung beetles and all that breaking down. So with all of these sorts of things, no carbon calculator is completely accurate to 2 decimal places. They are all a starting point, and they will continue to evolve and improve as we get better knowledge. But absolutely making sure we have things like, understanding the importance of dung beetles on reduction in emissions, as well as the ability to make sure, with their tunnels and stuff, that they're aerating the soil. They are incredibly important. And I would love to see a time, hopefully in the not too distant future, where when you're putting in the number of cows into your carbon calculator, you can also assess how many, you can put an assessment as to whether you've got good, medium or low dung beetles.
That would be fabulous. Do you want to comment on the
I
beetle?
can't add anything to that, Deborah. So no, that's a definitive answer there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was marvelous. There's various questions coming up, but we talked a little bit about middleman gaining more than the environment and the farmer. Do you think we've got some like measures and things, Adam, that are gonna secure us against some of those situations?
I think the key thing is understanding more about your farm than any middleman can, and I think that's where the baselining piece. And I'll stress it again. If you've got that baseline, if you don't have that baseline, you don't understand what the position of the farm is. It's much easier for a middleman to come in and say, look, I can sell this for you, I can sell that for you. Let me do all of the work and do all the baselining. But if you've got that ready, it helps you to engage with markets and brokers and the supply chain. So understand what the practice you're undertaking on your farm is actually doing, and what the baseline is it's giving you. Because somebody made the point earlier, I think in the questions, about if you've been doing it for 10 years, the risk is if you've been doing it for 10 years and you haven't baseline, you've lost all of that, and you've got no way of evidencing where you were 10 years before that. So baseline, that's going to make any of your conversations a lot easier and reduce reliance on the middleman.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a few things. I mean, I don't think we could. I don't know if necessarily anyone wants to pitch in and hazard a guess on what if you've what a baseline would look like on a mixed farm. Becky, I don't know if you want to try and tackle that one, or at least give some advice on where to start.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, what a baseline position looks like is a bit like how long is a piece of string. There are benchmarks out there. I think in terms of cost, I think what we're trying to do with any sampling strategy is to look at what is the least number of samples that I can take to deliver the most robust strategy that will give me what's called minimal detectable difference. So what we want to try and do is take out all of the other variation and all of the other variability apart from your management. So we need to select samples that, we are looking at underlying soil type, we are looking at crop type, we're looking at management, and trying to work together to deliver a soil sampling strategy which is not going to break the bank, as I say, which is not going to poke a hole in every square centimetre, but at the same time is going to give you confidence in terms of when you then come back and resample, the change is due to the fact that you've done cracking management. It's not because of the fact that we've taken the sample in a different place. It's not due to the fact that we have sent it to a different lab or those sorts of things. The other really important thing to remember for anybody that's thinking about baselining is that as well as taking our samples for organic carbon or organic matter or whatever it is, you also need to have a measurement of bulk density, because what is being traded is tons of carbon. And in order to get that tons of carbon calculation, you need to have an understanding of the density of your soil. So starting to take into account bulk density is really important. In terms of costs for sampling, it can vary. It can be not a huge amount of money, so sort of 30, 35 pounds if you're looking at a sort of aggregated sample over a field, right up to you can pay, hundreds of pounds. So it depends the number of samples that you need to take. And again, what I would do is I would ask those questions to whoever is coming to take that sample. And what tends to happen with the carbon markets is they want that third party to be taking the sample. So if you're taking the samples yourself, sometimes, you need to make sure that you're doing those in the best way possible. So GPS logging your location, making sure that you've got that audit trail in terms of when you've done them, all of that sort of stuff is really important. But often they want it to be done by an independent person, because sometimes they have this thing in their head that you're going to take a sample, that you're then going to go and shove a bag of compost on and you're going to take another sample. And I doubt anybody's going to do that, but they get very worried about that sort of thing. So again, being really transparent in terms of that methodology, GPS logging and all of that is really important.
Brilliant. Thank you, Becky. I think we're coming very much to the end, and I don't know if either of you got anything else you wanted to comment or add at this stage, but we've had a very good and frank discussion with a lot of really interesting questions, and like Becky, I particularly love the dung beetles coming in there and are starting to build big finance with our beneficial insects and looking at this whole horizon of change that we've got going on. So if I think we've probably reached the end, I would like to thank our speakers very much for attending and giving up some of their evening on this really fast-moving topic. And thanks, Tash, so much for arranging it and bringing us all together to have this conversation tonight. I think we've given the farmers a fair bit of things to dwell on, and hopefully we can continue some of these conversations going forward. So I hope it's been useful for everybody, and yeah, please keep in touch and follow this interesting topic, and thanks very much to everyone.